Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world that feels both distant and uncomfortably familiar. Picture Germany in 1919. The war is over, but the streets are littered with broken glass. Political posters pasted over one another like battle scars, and men in ragged uniforms wandering home with no medals, only memories they'd rather not keep. The German Empire, once proud and ironclad, had collapsed into chaos. Ordinary people were suddenly stuck in food lines that seemed longer than their paychecks, and children were growing up too fast in homes where laughter was replaced by arguments over rent and ration cards. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this if you were there. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world everyone is drifting off. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Germany, in ruins, was more than just rubble and debt. It was a state of mind. The Treaty of Versailles had not only redrawn borders, had redrawn the very idea of German pride. Huge chunks of territory were stripped away like a cruel haircut, leaving the nation humiliated and exposed. Reparations payments demanded by the Allies were staggering, like asking a drowning man to repay the ocean for every gulp of air he borrowed. And with every coin drained from the treasury, German citizens felt a little poorer, a little angrier, and a little more certain that someone, somewhere, had sold them out. This period became fertile soil for wild ideas. People gathered in beer halls, not just to drink, but to argue, vent, and search for anyone who could explain why their world had been shattered. Inflation didn't just nibble away at savings, it devoured them in one greedy gulp. Imagine being paid in the morning and watching the price of bread double by the evening. Housewives carried baskets of near-worthless banknotes, only to discover they could buy less than a stick of butter. Historians still argue whether the crushing reparations alone caused the collapse, or if poor governance made things worse. What we do know is that millions of people began to look for a scapegoat, a story that made the misery make sense. And here's a quirky detail. At the height of hyperinflation in 1923, some Germans literally used stacks of banknotes as wallpaper, because paper money was cheaper than actual wallpaper rolls. Families decorated their homes with money they couldn't spend, living rooms lined with marks that had once promised prosperity. It sounds absurd now, but it shows just how topsy-turvy reality had become. Politically, the streets of Berlin and Munich weren't just noisy, they were dangerous. Paramilitary groups, some clad in leftover army gear, marched with flags and clubs, clashing with rivals in alleys and town squares. Each group promised salvation, whether through socialism, nationalism, or radical revolution. Germany's fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic, often felt like a house of cards being built in a windstorm. The system was technically free and democratic, but few trusted it. Too many wanted strong leadership, a savior figure who could restore order, pride, and maybe even revenge. It was into this atmosphere, this strange cocktail of desperation and disillusion, that a young man named Adolf Hitler would stumble. But at this moment in the story, he's not yet the monster history remembers. He's one among millions, drifting through a defeated nation, feeling the sting of humiliation as sharply as any other veteran. The secret lies in how he turned personal bitterness into a national narrative. Remember this: in bedtime stories, monsters rarely appear fully grown. They start small, in the shadows, feeding quietly until the conditions are just right. Post-war Germany provided the shadows, the bitterness, and the hunger that would allow one such figure to rise. Adolf Hitler's story doesn't begin with a dictator's swagger or a politician's cunning. It begins, oddly enough, with paintbrushes, canvases, and a portfolio stuffed with rejected dreams. Before the world knew him as a tyrant, he was a frustrated young artist wandering the streets of Vienna with more ambition than talent. Imagine him in a worn coat, sitting in front of the grand facades of the city, sketching architectural lines with a sort of grim intensity. Vienna, at the turn of the 20th century, was a place of music, art, and intellectual fermenticity, brimming with Mozart's echoes and Freud's theories. For Hitler, it was also a city brimming with rejection slips. The young Adolf had applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, convinced that his watercolors and architectural sketches were enough to secure him a spot among Vienna's rising artists. Twice he was turned away. The examiners noted that while his technical lines were neat, his human figures lacked life. In other words, he could draw a building but not the soul inside it. Historians still argue whether these rejections really created the bitterness that later defined him, or if they simply revealed a streak already there. But there's no denying that being told you're not good enough shaped the way he saw the world. Harsh, unfair, and always stacked against him. Here's a quirky detail. During this period, Hitler actually earned a meager living by painting postcards and selling small street scenes to tourists. You could say he was the original struggling freelancer, hustling for a few coins while nursing a growing resentment. There are still collections of these postcards floating around today, quiet relics of a man who once wanted to be known for art, not war. Ironically, if he had been just a little better at shading human figures, history might have remembered him as an obscure painter instead of a dictator. But Vienna wasn't just about art. It was also a city simmering with ethnic tensions, radical politics, and toxic ideologies. Hitler absorbed them all like a sponge. The cafes and lecture halls were buzzing with debates on nationalism, socialism, and anti-Semitism. These ideas crept into his worldview, merging with his disappointments into a twisted philosophy. Scholars debate endlessly. Did Vienna create his ideology, or did it simply provide the fuel for a fire that was already smoldering? The truth, as always, is murky. When his mother died in 1907, the young Hitler's fragile life collapsed further. He drifted between cheap boarding houses, sometimes even sleeping on park benches, clutching at his sketchbooks as if they could anchor him. Imagine the bitter irony. While Vienna thrived as a capital of culture, one of its most infamous future residents spent nights huddled against the cold, unnoticed by the glittering society around him. Still, even in hardship, he nursed a sense of destiny. He wasn't just unlucky, he believed he was misunderstood, unrecognized by a blind world. That sense of victimhood, born from rejection letters and empty stomachs, would later mutate into something far darker. There's a small, almost humorous anecdote from this period. Hitler supposedly once tried to befriend a fellow painter by sharing bread and jam, only to rant about politics until the man slipped away and never returned. Even then, it seems, he couldn't resist turning casual company into a stage for his grievances. By 1913, weary of Vienna and still chasing vague dreams, Hitler moved to Munich. He was just another failed artist, lugging his past in a suitcase, unaware that history was quietly waiting for him. The city would soon provide him with both opportunity and tragedy. And when the guns of 1914 thundered across Europe, Adolf Hitler finally found the stage that would transform him from obscure dreamer into a soldier of destiny. When the First World War erupted in the summer of 1914, Adolf Hitler was, by all accounts, adrift. He was 25 years old, without steady work, without a family of his own, and still clinging to those failed dreams of artistic greatness. But the call to arms lit something inside him. For a man who had felt invisible for most of his youth, the chance to wear a uniform and be part of something larger was intoxicating. He volunteered for the Bavarian army, despite technically being an Austrian citizen, and, remarkably, was accepted. For Hitler, the war was not just another chapter, it was a transformation. The trenches of the Western Front, grim and foul as they were, became the forge that hardened his identity. Imagine mud up to your knees, rats scurrying along the parapets, and artillery shells screaming overhead like a constant reminder that life was balanced on the edge of a bayonet. In this world of ceaseless chaos, Hitler found, oddly enough, clarity. He embraced the camaraderie of the regiment, the iron discipline, and the sense that finally his life had meaning. It's worth noting a historical fact. Here, Hitler served as a dispatch runner, which meant he carried messages across dangerous front lines. This wasn't glamorous, but it was perilous. He earned the Iron Cross, second class, and later, the Iron Cross, first class, an award rare for someone of his rank. The irony is sharp. This man, who later plunged the world into carnage, once risked his life repeatedly for small scraps of paper that might shift a battle. Yet, not everything was as heroic as he imagined. Hitler was wounded in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest slaughters in military history. Shrapnel tore into his thigh, forcing him off the line. For months, he returned, however, determined and eager, as if the wound had only deepened his sense of belonging. Then, in 1918, he was temporarily blinded by a mustard gas attack near Ypres. In a military hospital, eyes bandaged, news reached him. Germany had surrendered. The Kaiser's empire had crumbled, and the war was lost. For Hitler, it was not just a national humiliation, was a personal betrayal. Here's a quirky detail. While recuperating, he reportedly wept uncontrollably at the news of defeat. Imagine the irony. This man, later depicted as a stoic, unyielding Führer, sobbing in a military ward, surrounded by men coughing their lungs out from poison gas. The tears weren't only for the lost war, they were for the lost sense of destiny. He thought he had finally grasped. Historians still argue about this moment. Some claim the gas attack literally altered his personality. Damage to the eyes or nervous system may have left lasting effects. Others insist it was purely psychological. The trauma of seeing his one source of meaning ripped away. Either way, when the bandages came off, Hitler looked out onto a world he believed had betrayed him. He absorbed the stab in the back myth that quickly spread through Germany, the false belief that the army had not been defeated in battle, but sabotaged by politicians, leftists, and Jews on the home front. To him, the war had not been lost honorably on the field, but stolen in the shadows. That poisonous idea sank deep into his psyche and would later bloom into his darkest rhetoric. One small anecdote shows how strange his war years were. Comrades remembered him as oddly solitary, while others gambled, joked, or chased women during leave. Hitler spent his downtime painting battlefields, sketching soldiers, and lecturing on politics. He was both respected for his courage and quietly mocked for being, well, a bit odd. The man who would one day mesmerize millions could not even hold the attention of a barracks card game. When the armistice was signed, Hitler left the hospital and returned to Munich, carrying medals on his chest, but bitterness in his heart. For him, the war was never truly over. It became the central wound of his life, one he would never allow to heal in, one he would insist Germany, too, must avenge. Munich, in 1919, was not the charming Bavarian postcard city of beer gardens and brass bands. It was, quite frankly, a powder keg. The war was over, the empire was gone, and in its place was chaos, political riots, hunger strikes, and the ever-present fear that communism, which had just taken root in Russia, might spread westward like wildfire. Into this chaos walked Adolf Hitler, a war veteran with medals on his chest, but no real direction in life. He still looked like the oddball soldier his comrades remembered, disciplined, solitary, more comfortable sketching or ranting about politics than making small talk. But the streets of Munich were about to give him a stage he never expected. The beer halls were the true theaters of politics in Bavaria. These weren't just places to drink. They were arenas where voices echoed under wooden rafters and cigarette smoke curled above crowds hungry for answers. You can almost imagine the scene: mugs slamming on tables, speakers pounding their fists, the crowd roaring approval or hissing dissent. Hitler began attending these gatherings, not as a leader, but as an observer, a former soldier drifting through the debates. Yet, when he opened his mouth, something surprising happened. People listened. Historical fact. In September 1919, Hitler attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party, DAP, a tiny fringe group with barely a few dozen members. He wasn't particularly interested at first. He was even sent by the army to keep an eye on radical groups. But when one speaker suggested Bavaria should break away from Germany, Hitler exploded. He stood up and delivered a furious rebuttal, so fiery that the party's founder took notice. Within days, Hitler was invited to join. That obscure little meeting would be the first step on his road to absolute power. Here's a quirky detail. Hitler initially resisted joining, insisting he had no interest in small politics. But the group's founder handed him a pamphlet that said members could pay as little as 50 pfennigs. Hitler laughed. It cost less than a loaf of bread, so he joined, half out of curiosity. Sometimes history turns on ridiculous details like the price of admission. From there, things moved quickly. He discovered, to his own surprise, that he had a gift for speaking. His voice, sharp and hypnotic, could cut through the din of clinking glasses and seize a room's attention. He gestured wildly, painted vivid pictures of betrayal and rebirth, and played on the emotions of veterans and workers who felt abandoned by the Weimar Republic. Soon, he wasn't just another member. He was the star attraction. Historians still argue whether his talent was innate or sharpened through practice. Some claim he rehearsed obsessively, pacing and gesticulating in front of a mirror like an actor. Others think the raw anger and conviction in his words made them magnetic, regardless of technique. What we do know is that in those smoky halls, Hitler discovered his true art, not painting landscapes, but painting emotions across the faces of a crowd. The German Workers' Party soon rebranded itself as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. The new name was meant to cast a wider net, blending nationalism with appeals to the working class. Hitler wasn't yet in charge, but he was already shaping the brand, tinkering with symbols, phrases, and slogans that would stick. The swastika, the straight-armed salute, the red banners, they all began taking root in this era. There's a near humorous anecdote here. Early Nazi meetings were so small that members sometimes had to pass the hat around to cover the cost of beer. Imagine a future dictator shaking down his fellow radicals for a few coins just to keep the meeting going. Not exactly the stuff of world domination yet, but the energy was undeniable. Crowds grew. Rumors spread of this electrifying speaker, who, by 1923, the Nazi Party was no longer a beer hall novelty. It had uniforms, banners, and an ever-growing crowd of followers who shouted themselves hoarse at rallies. Hitler, now firmly at the helm, had developed a knack for turning anger into theater, but ambition was outrunning reality. He didn't just want to preach to Munich taverns, he wanted to seize power, and in his mind, Germany's crisis of the early 1920s was the perfect opening. The country was staggering under hyperinflation. We're talking bread that cost billions of marks, waiters rushing to adjust menu prices mid-meal, and wages paid twice daily because money lost value by the hour. People carted wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy groceries, only to discover the grocer preferred being paid in eggs. Against this backdrop of absurdity, Hitler believed Germans were desperate enough to welcome a bold stroke. His model, Mussolini's recent march on Rome, where fascists seized power with a swaggering display. If it worked in Italy, why not in Germany? On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his stormtroopers burst into a Munich beer hall where Bavarian leaders were meeting. Pistols were raised, shots fired into the ceiling, and Hitler declared a national revolution. You can almost picture the scene. Red-faced politicians held at gunpoint, beer glasses frozen halfway to lips, and Hitler shouting himself hoarse about destiny. He truly believed that with enough force of will and enough armed supporters, the state would collapse into his hands. Here's a quirky detail in the confusion. Hitler actually climbed onto a chair to make his proclamations, waving a pistol in one hand and trying not to topple over. For a man who imagined himself a world conqueror, he looked more like a frantic pub performer trying to keep his balance. The coup, later dubbed the beer hall putsch, quickly unraveled. The next morning, when Hitler's followers marched through Munich, the police opened fire. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed, the rest scattered. Hitler himself dove into the chaos and was injured when he fell, dislocating his shoulder. Instead of seizing Germany, he ended up hiding in the attic of a sympathetic family until the police found him. The revolution, it turned out, was over before the buyer went flat. Historians still debate what this failure meant. Some argue it was a turning point. Hitler realized brute force alone couldn't topple the state, and that legal political maneuvering was the smarter path. Others think it was sheer luck he failed. Had he succeeded, an unstable Germany in 1923 might have collapsed into dictatorship far earlier, changing the entire timeline of the 20th century. The trial that followed turned Hitler from local nuisance into national celebrity. In a courtroom packed with journalists, he transformed proceedings into a propaganda platform. He thundered against the Weimar Republic, painted himself as a patriot wronged, and delivered speeches that made headlines across Germany. One reporter noted that he seemed less like a defendant than a professor lecturing his students. The sentence? 5 years in prison, though he would serve less than one. Landsberg prison, where he was sent, was hardly a dungeon. It was more like a fortress-style boarding house, complete with decent food, visiting privileges, and plenty of time to think. Hitler wasn't crushed by his failure. He was recalibrating. And in those quiet stone walls, the next phase of his rise was already taking shape. Still, it's almost comical to imagine the man who dreamed of a grand revolution, who imagined himself striding into Berlin as a conquering hero, instead limped into a cell, licking his wounds and scribbling notes. Yet, just as monsters grow stronger in the dark, Hitler's time behind bars gave him the opportunity to refine his story, polish his venom, and plan his return. Landsberg prison might sound like the end of the road, but for Adolf Hitler it was more like a writer's retreat, albeit one guarded by iron gates and uniformed wardens. After the fiasco of the beer hall putsch, he could have faded into obscurity, remembered only as a failed rabble-rouser who once waved a pistol on a beer hall chair. Instead, prison gave him time, quiet, and perhaps most importantly, an audience of loyal comrades who treated him less like a convict and more like a prophet. In waiting, it was here that Hitler began dictating Mein Kampf, My Struggle, to Rudolf Hess, one of his most devoted followers. On paper, it was an autobiography mixed with a political manifesto, a jumble of half-baked history lessons, ranting ideology, and future plans. Yet beneath the disorganized prose, something chilling was taking shape. A blueprint he laid out. His obsessions with race, his hatred of Jews, his vision of a German empire stretching across Europe, and his unshakable belief that destiny had chosen him to lead. Here's a quirky detail. The book originally had the clunky working title for "and a half years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice." Imagine trying to fit that on a bookstore shelf. Thankfully or unfortunately, depending on how you see it, his publisher shortened it to the snappier Mein Kampf. The original title reads less like a call to arms and more like the rant of someone who lost a very bad group project. Historians still argue about Mein Kampf's significance. Some insist people should have taken it more seriously, was all there in black and white, the roadmap for what he intended. Others counter that many dismissed it at the time as incoherent rambling, not realizing how deadly those ideas could become once given state power. Either way, it is unsettling to flip through those pages, knowing how much of it would later unfold with terrifying precision. Hitler's time in prison was surprisingly comfortable. He received visitors, had his meals delivered, and walked the grounds like a man already rehearsing for leadership. Guards treated him with respect, and sympathetic politicians quietly signaled that his ideas might still have a future. It wasn't the punishment of a defeated man, it was the incubation of one. The quirky side of this period is that Hitler, stripped of the chaos of rallies and marches, spent hours fine-tuning speeches in his head. Fellow inmates later recalled how he paced, gesticulated, and even practiced dramatic pauses, as if his audience were invisible, but ever-present. For him, every word was rehearsal for the stage he believed destiny would one day grant him. By the end of 1924, political tides had shifted, and Hitler was released after serving just 9 months of his 5-year sentence. He emerged not humbled, but hardened, carrying under his arm the first volume of a book that would become required reading for his followers. He had failed once, yes, but now he understood something vital. The revolution wouldn't come from a reckless march. It would come from patience, propaganda, and the ballot box. Remember that sardine tin of odd details we've been keeping open. Here's another. Hitler's prison cell received so many flowers from admirers that it looked more like a bizarre wedding suite than a place of punishment. Imagine visiting a man convicted of treason and finding his cell overflowing with bouquets, as if treason were an anniversary to be celebrated. When he stepped back into public life, Hitler wasn't the ragtag revolutionary anymore. He was the author of a manifesto, the martyr of a failed coup, and, in his own mind, the man destiny had spared for greater things. Prison had not broken, Hemet had polished him. The monster had been caged, yes, but it had only grown sharper claws while waiting in the dark. Germany, in the late 1920s, was like a patient staggering between fever and remission. On the surface, things seemed to improve. The Dawes Plan restructured reparations, American loans flowed in, and for a few brief years, Berlin even pulsed with jazz clubs, cabaret dancers, and an avant-garde art scene that shocked traditionalists. The mark stabilized. People could once again afford bread without hauling wheelbarrows of cash, and the Weimar Republic looked, if not sturdy, at least less fragile. For many Germans, it seemed as though the chaos had finally calmed, but beneath that thin veneer resentments simmered. Rural communities and conservative families eyed the decadence of Berlin with suspicion, muttering that this isn't the Germany we fought for. Veterans still felt discarded, their sacrifices unrecognized, and inflation, though cooled, had left deep scars. No one forgot the humiliation of wallpapering homes with useless money. The mood was fragile, the economy built on foreign loans. Like a house of cards balanced on someone else's table, into this environment stepped Hitler, fresh out of prison, determined to rebuild the Nazi Party. He rebranded it from a gang of thugs into a disciplined movement. Uniforms became sharper, marches more orderly, and propaganda more sophisticated. Joseph Goebbels, a fiery intellectual with a gift for media, was brought in to orchestrate the messaging. Together, they turned slogans into symphonies, parades into theater, and a fringe party into a brand. Here's a quirky detail. Nazi rallies often featured carefully timed drum rolls and choreographed torchlight parades. It wasn't accidental, it was designed to stir emotion and give the illusion of unstoppable momentum. Think less political meeting, more rock concert with military precision. Attendees often said they felt swept up, like part of something historic, even if all they'd really done was march in circles. Historians still debate how much credit the economic crash of 1929 deserves for Hitler's rise. The Wall Street collapse triggered a global depression, and suddenly Germany's fragile recovery crumbled. American loans dried up, unemployment soared, and hunger lines reappeared. Was it Hitler's brilliance, or just the timing of catastrophe, that opened the door? Likely both. Without the Great Depression, his rants might have remained beer hall curiosities. With it, they struck chords of desperation that resonated nationwide by 1930. The Nazi Party was winning millions of votes. They weren't a fringe anymore, were the second largest party in Germany's parliament. Hitler's message was simple. Germany had been betrayed, humiliated, and robbed, and only a strong leader could restore pride. That leader, of course, was himself. But success came with spectacle. Hitler's speeches became legendary. He would begin quietly, almost conversationally, building tension like a violinist tuning strings. Then, with sudden crescendos, his voice would thunder, his fist would slam, his eyes Blazedenses described it as hypnotic. People left his rallies not just convinced, but electrified. One journalist noted, "He doesn't argue, he casts a spell." Yet, behind the spectacle, there was calculation. Hitler avoided reckless putsch attempts. Now, instead, he targeted voters disillusioned with democracy, farmers tired of falling crop prices, middle-class families terrified of losing everything again. He promised jobs, stability, and a return to glory, while quietly blaming Jews, communists, and traitors for every ill. It was a simple formula: comfort the anxious, flatter the proud, and demonize the vulnerable. Another odd anecdote: Nazi campaigners in rural areas sometimes brought along gramophones to play Hitler's speeches to villagers who couldn't attend rallies. Imagine standing in a barn, listening to scratchy records of a man yelling about destiny, while cows looked on in bemusement. And yet, it worked. Propaganda reached even the most remote corners. By the early 1930s, Germany was sliding deeper into crisis, and Hitler's party was positioned as the only one with energy, unity, and certainty. The monster was no longer lurking in beer halls or scribbling in prison notebooks. It was standing on podiums, marching in torchlight, and appearing on ballots. The rise was no longer a secret, it was happening in broad daylight. By the early 1930s, the Nazi movement was no longer a fringe irritant, was a tidal wave of spectacle, slogans, and carefully manufactured myth. At the heart of this transformation was Joseph Goebbels, the short, sharp-witted propagandist, who understood something Hitler himself only instinctively grasped. Politics in the modern age was not about policies, it was about theater. And the Nazi Party became a masterclass in staging drama. Picture a rally, vast fields lit with torches, thousands of flags rippling like crimson seas, and loudspeakers booming Hitler's words to audiences who might otherwise never hear them. The choreography was deliberate. Marching bands drummed in lockstep, stormtroopers lined up in intimidating rows, and banners unfurled at precisely the right moment. Even the silence was staged. Hitler sometimes paused for such long stretches that the crowd leaned forward, desperate, before he thundered back into speech. It was less about ideas than about immersion. One mainstream fact worth remembering is how technology amplified all this. Radio, still a relatively new medium, became Hitler's invisible megaphone. Cheap people's receivers were mass-produced, so nearly every German household could tune in. Families gathered in living rooms, not for music or news, but to hear the Führer's voice filling their walls. Historians still debate whether people were genuinely persuaded or simply swept along by the sheer omnipresence of his message, but either way, silence in dissent became harder and harder. Here's a quirky detail. Goebbels once ordered film crews to shoot Hitler from low angles during rallies to make him appear taller and more imposing. The reality: Hitler was of average height, sometimes even looking small among his officers. But on film, thanks to clever staging, he loomed like a giant. It was political Instagram before Instagram existed. The myth-making didn't stop at visuals. Hitler was deliberately presented as both ordinary and extraordinary. Posters showed him surrounded by children, dogs, and adoring women, the people's friend. Yet speeches described him as a man touched by destiny, the only leader who could save Germany. That strange duality, neighborly yet messianic, made him accessible and untouchable at the same time. Historians still argue whether the German public truly believed this cult of personality or simply played along. Was it deep conviction, shallow conformity, or a mix of both? The answer probably lies somewhere in the gray. Some swooned at his rallies. Others rolled their eyes in private, but dared not say so out loud. And then there were the symbols. The swastika, once an ancient emblem, was reborn as the Nazis' ubiquitous logo. Red banners flooded town squares, uniforms were tailored to impress, and the straight-armed salute turned every public encounter into a mini ritual of allegiance. Goebbels understood branding long before corporations studied it. Every image, every color, every gesture reinforced the sense that this movement was unstoppable. Here's another quirky anecdote. Early Nazi leaflets were so cheaply printed that the ink often rubbed off on readers' hands, leaving them literally stained by the propaganda. Supporters joked it was a badge of honor, but opponents muttered it was fitting dirty lies, leaving dirty marks. By the early 1930s, The Nazi rallies had become tourist attractions in themselves. Foreign journalists, skeptical at first, came to witness them and left unnerved, writing about the strange electricity of these gatherings. Some called it mass hypnosis. Others compared it to religious revival meetings. One British observer dryly noted, "It is astonishing how many people will stand in the rain for hours just to hear the same phrases shouted again." But repetition was the point. Hitler's speeches hammered the same themes again and again: betrayal, humiliation, destiny, rebirth. And in a Germany battered by unemployment and despair, those words offered clarity, however poisonous. Remember the postcard-painting young man in Vienna who couldn't capture the soul of a face? Now, with Goebbels' help, he was painting an entire nation, this time, not with brushes, but with symbols, slogans, and spectacle. The canvas was Germany itself, and the monster was learning how to make millions believe they wanted to be part of the picture. By 1932, Hitler was no longer the eccentric demagogue of Munich beer halls. He was a national figure, a man whose rallies drew tens of thousands, and whose party banners decorated towns across Germany. The Nazis had surged in elections, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag. Yet despite this momentum, Hitler still wasn't in power. For all the spectacle, the Weimar Republic clung on, and old guard politicians remained wary of handing the keys of government to someone they considered a dangerous radical. But politics is rarely about trust, it's about deals behind closed doors. Germany's conservative elites believed they could use Hitler. Men like Franz von Papen and President Paul von Hindenburg thought of him as a tool, fiery enough to rally the masses, but controllable once inside government. They underestimated him spectacularly. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Crowds filled the streets in torchlit parades, cheering as if the nation had been reborn. For many, it was relief. Finally, someone decisive had arrived. For others, it was dread, though their voices were drowned out. Here's a quirky detail. The day after becoming chancellor, Hitler supposedly refused to move into the official chancellor's residence until his personal furniture, complete with his favorite desk and a battered chair, was brought over. Even at the threshold of power, he clung to his personal quirks, as if to remind himself this was not a dream, but reality he could furnish as he pleased. The transition from chancellor to dictator happened with astonishing speed. Just a month into office, the Reichstag building caught fire. A Dutch communist was blamed, but historians still argue whether the Nazis themselves orchestrated it. Either way, the fire became the perfect pretext. Civil liberties were suspended, opponents were arrested, and fear was whipped into frenzy. Hitler, who just weeks earlier had to negotiate with rivals, suddenly wielded emergency powers. In March 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, effectively handing Hitler the authority to legislate without parliamentary approval. It was, in essence, democracy voting itself out of existence. Some deputies protested, but Nazi stormtroopers lined the chamber, glaring down at dissenters. The law passed, and the fragile Weimar Republic ceased to function. Historians still debate whether Germans knew what they were giving away in that moment. Some argue the majority supported it, tired of instability and chaos. Others insist fear and intimidation drove the vote. Either way, what had been a democracy dissolved almost overnight into dictatorship. Meanwhile, Hitler wasted no time consolidating control. Rival parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, and regional governments subordinated to Berlin. The press was muzzled, opponents jailed, and dissent turned dangerous. Propaganda declared that Germany had entered a new dawn, with Hitler as both savior and architect. And yet, beneath the terror, some details bordered on absurd. Nazi officials once fretted about whether government buildings should feature portraits of Hitler in every room or just the main halls. The debate wasn't about politics, but about how much wall space could be spared without looking insufficiently loyal. It's almost darkly comic bureaucrats measuring wall dimensions while the machinery of dictatorship rolled into place. By 1934, Hitler's grip was nearly absolute. The last obstacle was within his own party, the rowdy paramilitary wing, the SA, whose leader Ernst Röhm dreamed of greater power. In June, Hitler struck during the so-called Night of the Long Knives. Röhm and other rivals were purged. It was bloody, though kept behind closed doors, and it sent a clear message: there would be no challengers, not even from within. When President Hindenburg died later that year, Hitler merged the presidency with the chancellorship, declaring himself Führer. Soldiers swore personal loyalty not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to him. The transformation was complete in just 18 months. A system designed to prevent dictatorship had birthed one. Remember the fumbling agitator of 1923 who toppled off a chair, waving a pistol. Now he stood at the pinnacle of power, master of a nation that had willingly, sometimes eagerly, handed him the reins. The monster was no longer growing, it had arrived. With power consolidated, Adolf Hitler no longer needed to shout himself hoarse in Munich beer halls or pace a prison cell rehearsing lines. Now, the German state itself was his stage, and every institution, every office, every schoolroom became part of his theater. The monster had been unleashed. From 1934 onward, Germany transformed with startling speed. Nazi flags blanketed entire city squares. Radios blared Hitler's speeches as if they were gospel. School books were rewritten to glorify Aryan destiny. The cult of personality was now total. Children were taught to idolize him. Workers marched in parades for him, and even housewives were encouraged to see him as a fatherly figure who would guard their future. For the first time in his life, Hitler was not on the margins of society, was its beating center. A mainstream fact underscores this shift. In 1936, when Germany hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin, the world saw a polished version of Hitler's Reich. Stadiums gleamed, banners fluttered, and the Nazi salute appeared. On the global stage, international visitors remarked on the order and efficiency, not realizing they were being shown a carefully choreographed performance. Behind the spectacle, concentration camps were already filling. Dissent was already crushed, and Jews were being systematically stripped of rights. The world watched, impressed by the theater, but largely blind to the terror backstage. Here's a quirky, almost surreal detail. Hitler was famously teetotal and vegetarian, hardly the image of the beer-swilling, sausage-munching German stereotype. While his rallies glorified raw strength and indulgence in national pride, his own dinners were often simple vegetable dishes. One bemused British diplomat noted, "The Führer eats as though he were a monk." In private, the man who craved absolute power had surprisingly ascetic habits. Yet, historians still argue whether Hitler's rise was inevitable once he became chancellor, or whether a stronger resistance from political leaders could have stopped him in those first months. Was the world sleepwalking into dictatorship, or was it actively complicit by underestimating him? The debate lingers because it asks an uncomfortable question: how often do societies trade freedom for the illusion of stability? By the late 1930s, the consequences of Hitler's rule were impossible to miss. The Gestapo's shadow fell across every neighborhood. Whispered criticism could mean imprisonment. Neighbors eyed one another nervously, wondering who might report whom. Jews, once integrated members of German society, found themselves excluded, humiliated, and terrorized. And all the while, Hitler spoke of destiny, of living space, of a future that would require yet another war. Remember those odd sardine tins of detail we've opened along the way? From postcards in Vienna to flowers in a prison cell, they all point to one truth. Hitler did not emerge fully formed as a monster. He stumbled, failed, recalibrated, and learned. He was overlooked, underestimated, even laughed at. And yet, in the cracks of a broken nation, he found the room to grow, as bedtime storytelling goes. This one isn't soothing in the traditional sense, but perhaps that's the point. History's monsters rarely arrive announced, they creep in, through chaos, charm, and coincidence, until one day the laughter fades and the nightmare feels normal. So, as we close tonight's journey, let's take a step back from the torchlight parades and the echoing speeches. Slow the pace, breathe a little deeper. The story of Hitler's rise is unsettling, but it carries a quiet lesson. Societies don't crumble all at once. They falter piece by piece, while most people are just trying to live their lives, pay their bills, and hope for calmer days. Picture, for a moment, an ordinary German family in the 1930s, children doing homework by the radio as Hitler's voice fills the room. A mother saving scraps to stretch supper a little further. A father quietly relieved to have steady work again after years of uncertainty. In their home, the changes might have felt like stability returning, not freedom vanishing. That's how history often works: incremental, almost invisible, until the shape of life itself has shifted. As you drift toward sleep, let the details soften. The flags fold into shadows, the speeches dissolve into faint echoes, the marching footsteps fade into silence. What remains is the reminder that vigilance matters, that freedom is fragile, and that even the darkest chapters can serve as warnings whispered forward through time. You're safe here, in this quiet moment. The story is behind us now, tucked away like a closed book on a shelf. Let the hum